Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? We are in the land of make-believe once again. Today, we are, for all intents and purposes, greeting the morning of Tuesday, August 14th. No, Tuesday, August 15th, as a matter of fact. We'll get that right. Why not just keep the error in there for authenticity's sake? Tuesday, August 15th, my family and I are on the road, but I did not want to leave you in the lurch, although it will be extraordinarily difficult to keep you up to date on all of the new happenings and all the Donald Trump rage tweeting, presuming, of course, that he is still president at the point at which we release this podcast. It looks likely, but not really favorable for, let's say, the existence of the United States as an independent political entity any time into the future. But hey, what can you do? So what will we do with the break? Well, I thought this would make an excellent opportunity to explore some of the back catalog, not of our own show, but of Pocket. All the interesting articles which I never got a chance to get to, I now have the opportunity to revive and share with you and comment on and see if we can just we'll use the break to get back to some of these things which have been themes in the show or just things that I thought were of interest at the time that I just couldn't cram into a show. We won't get to everything, but I have one item that I knew as soon as I saw it scrolling through Pocket that I just had to pull this one up. This has been addressed on the show so many times and is such an interesting theme to me. And one that I just sort of pulled out of a hat. I always felt like this was something, we discuss it all the time. You'll recognize it instantly. And I never really was sure that I had any academic backing on my own sort of pet theory about this stuff, but it seems that I do. Stephen Pearlstein has been backing me up on it for a long time, and I didn't even know about it. This is an article published in the Washington Post on September 9th, 2013. And you'll know exactly where we're going as soon as I read you the title, How the Cult of Shareholder Value Wrecked American Business. Yes, I believe we began discussing this without ever reading through this thing. And then when I saw it, I put it aside and said, I'll bring this up and we'll lend some academic heft to this pet theory. And we never got around to doing it. I think it has proven itself largely true anyway. I'm clearly not the first one to have discovered it, but I do think it's an important thing. We keep coming back to it, and it's important to remind ourselves of it every chance we get. The piece, as I mentioned, September 9th, 2013, begins this way. In the recent history of management ideas, few have had a more profound or pernicious effect than the one that says corporations should be run in a manner that maximizes shareholder value. Indeed, you could argue that much of what Americans perceive to be wrong with the economy these days, and it's back in 2013, of course, the slow growth and rising inequality, the recurring scandals, the wild swings from boom to bust, the inadequate investment in R&D, worker training, and public goods has its roots in this ideology, and it is an ideology. The funny thing is that this supposed imperative to maximize a company's share price has no foundation in history or in law, nor is there any empirical evidence that it makes the economy or the society better off. What began in the 1970s and 80s as a useful corrective to self-satisfied managerial mediocrity has become a corrupting, self-interested dogma peddled by finance professors, money managers, and overcompensated corporate executives. What I have always liked to refer to as MBA culture. Let's start with some simple history. The earliest American corporations were generally chartered for public purposes, such as building canals or transit systems, and well into the 1960s were widely viewed as owing something in return to a society that provided them with legal protections and an economic ecosystem in which to grow and thrive. It's amazing how much that has deteriorated, by the way, and now the more protection you afford these entities, whether these entities are wealthy individuals or corporations, the more they feel entitled to that, the continuance of that protection, and even more protections. It is rather amazing. All the while, of course, insisting that it is those on the lowest end of the economic scale who were destroyed by entitlement culture. Well, I don't know about that. Anyway, continuing here, in 1953, car maker Charlie Wilson famously spoke for a generation of chief executives about the link between business and the larger society when he told a Senate committee that, quote, "What is good for the country is good for General Motors and vice versa." Boy, that made a lot of sense. There are no statutes that put the shareholder at the top of the corporate priority list. In most states, corporations can be formed for any lawful purpose. Cornell University law professor Lynn Stout has been looking for years for a corporate charter that even mentions maximizing profits or share price. She hasn't found one. Nor does the law require, as many believe, that executives and directors owe a special fiduciary duty to shareholders. The fiduciary duty, in fact, is owed simply to the corporation, which is owned by no one, just as you and I are owned by no one. We are all persons in the eye of the law. That would mean corporations as well. Shareholders, however, have a contractual claim to the residual value of the corporation once all its other obligations have been satisfied. And even then, directors are given wide latitude to make whatever use of that residual value they choose, as long as they're not stealing it for themselves. I'd just like to pause there for a second and sort of reiterate something that we glossed over on our way to the end of the paragraph there. Shareholders have a contractual claim to the residual value of the corporation once all other obligations have been satisfied. Again, all other obligations takes us back to the realm of the stakeholder and not the shareholder. There are a lot of obligations that a corporation has. How we wrote these other obligations out, well, that's the story of the 1980s, really, and everything that's come since, and MBA culture in general. Continuing with the article, it is true that only shareholders have the power to select a corporation's directors, but it requires the peculiar imagination of a corporate lawyer to leap from that to a broad mandate that those directors have a duty to put the interests of shareholders above all others. How then did maximizing shareholder value evolve into such a widely accepted norm of corporate behavior? That's not normal, like so many things. The most likely explanations for this transformation are two broad structural changes. Globalization, boo, everybody hates it, right? And deregulation, boo, we all hate that one too. Those two things kind of suck in many ways, don't you think? Okay, sure. There's some great benefits to globalization. Don't tell anybody I said that, but it's true. Deregulation occasionally too. But all things in moderation. Anyway, globalization and deregulation, which together conspired to rob many major corporations of the outsized profits they had earned during the golden decades after World War II. Not often listed among the victims of globalization and deregulation are American corporations, but they have a point. At that point in time, anyway. Those profits in those golden decades were so generous that there was enough to satisfy nearly all the corporate stakeholders. But in the 1970s, when increased competition started to squeeze out profits, it was easier for executives to disappoint shareholders than their workers or communities. Why? Stronger unions, weaker corporate law and protection for shareholders, etc. That all began to evolve and change, kind of hand in glove, but, interesting to note. Anyway, so the 1970s, increased competition started to squeeze out profits, easier at that point, believe it or not. There was such a time when it was easier for executives to disappoint shareholders than their workers or communities. The result was a lost decade for investors. No surprise, then, that by the mid-1980s, companies with lagging stock prices found themselves targets for hostile takeovers by rivals or corporate raiders using newfangled junk bonds to finance their purchases. Wall Street, the movie, that is. Disgruntled shareholders were only too willing to sell, and so it developed that the mere threat of a possible takeover imbued corporate executives and directors with a new focus on profits and share prices, tossing aside old inhibitions against laying off workers, cutting wages, closing plants, spinning off divisions, and outsourcing production overseas. Yes, there was a time when that actually those things were actually the subject of inhibitions. Now, of course, they're outright goals. Today's activist investor hedge funds, which have amassed war chests of tens of billions of dollars to take on the likes of Microsoft, Procter & Gamble, PepsiCo, and Apple, are the direct descendants of these 1980s corporate raiders. While it was this new market for corporate control, as economists like to call it, that created the imperative to boost near-term profits and share prices, an elaborate institutional infrastructure has grown up to reinforce it. This infrastructure includes business schools that indoctrinate students, that's exactly what it is, indoctrinate students with the shareholder-first ideology and equip them with tools to manipulate quarterly earnings and short-term share prices. It includes corporate lawyers who reflexively advise against any action that might lower the share price and invite shareholder lawsuits, however frivolous. It includes a Wall Street establishment that is thoroughly fixated on quarterly earnings, quarterly investment returns, and short-term trading. And most of all, it is reinforced by gluttonous pay packages for top executives that are tied to the short-term performance of the company's stock. The result is a self-reinforcing cycle in which corporate time horizons have become shorter and shorter. The average holding periods for corporate stocks, which for decades was 6 years, is now down to less than 6 months. The average tenure of a public company chief executive is down to less than 4 years. And the willingness of executives to sacrifice short-term profits to make long-term investments is rapidly disappearing. A recent study by the consultants at McKinsey & Company and Canada's Public Pension Board found alarming levels of short-termism in the corporate executive suite. They reported that nearly 80% of top executives and directors reported feeling most pressured to demonstrate a strong financial performance over a period of 2 years or less, with only 7% feeling pressured to deliver a strong performance over a period of 5 years or more. They also found that 55% of chief financial officers would forego an attractive investment project today if it would cause the company to even marginally miss its quarterly earnings target. The real irony surrounding this focus on maximizing shareholder value is that it hasn't, in fact, done much for shareholders. Roger Martin, the outgoing dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, calculates that from 1932 until 1976, roughly speaking, the era of managerial capitalism, in which managers sought to balance the interests of shareholders with those of employees, customers, and the society at large, the stakeholders, as I like to refer to them, the total real compound annual return on the stocks of the S&P 500 was 7.6%. From 1976 until the present, roughly the period of shareholder capitalism, important terminology, shareholder capitalism. I like that. We're going to have to hold on to that one. The comparable return during the period of shareholder capitalism has been 6.4%. That's a full 1.25 lower. Obviously, a lot of other things happened during those two periods that could have affected returns to shareholders. One thing we know is that less and less of the wealth generated by the corporate sector was going to frontline workers. Another is that more and more of it was going to top executives. According to Martin, the ratio of chief executive compensation to corporate profits increased eightfold between 1980 and 2000. Almost all of that increase came from stock-based compensation. One practical problem is that it's not clear which shareholders it is whose interests the corporation is supposed to optimize. Should it be the hedge funds that are buying and selling millions of shares every couple of seconds to earn hedge fund-like returns? Or mutual funds holding the stock for a couple of years? Or the retired teacher in Dubuque, Iowa, who has held it for decades? Companies might try to answer this question by giving shareholders more of a voice in how the companies are run, but it turns out that even as they proclaim their unwavering dedication to the interest of shareholders, corporate executives and directors have been doing everything possible to minimize and discourage shareholder involvement in corporate governance. This blatant hypocrisy is most recently revealed in the all-out effort by the business lobby to prevent shareholders from voting on executive pay or having the right to nominate a competing slate of directors. For too many corporations, maximizing shareholder value has also provided justification for bamboozling customers, squeezing suppliers and employees, avoiding taxes, and leaving communities in the lurch. For any one profit maximizing company, such behavior may be perfectly rational. But when competition forces all companies to behave in this fashion, it's hardly clear that society is better off. Take the example of outsourcing production overseas. Certainly it makes sense for any one company to aggressively pursue such a strategy, but when every company does it, so many American workers wind up losing their jobs or having their pay cut that they can no longer buy even the cheaper goods produced overseas. The companies may also find that government no longer has sufficient tax revenue to educate workers or invest in the roads and ports and airports through which their goods are delivered to market. Economists have a name for such unintended spillover effects, negative externalities, and normally the right fix is some form of government action. But one of the hallmarks of the era of shareholder capitalism is that every tax and every regulation, that is to say, I guess, everything that every government action that they can take, is reflexively opposed by the business community as an assault on profits and shareholder value. By this logic, not only must corporations commit themselves to putting shareholders first, society is expected to do so as well. Perhaps the most ridiculous aspect of shareholder über alles, as they put it, is how at odds it is with every modern theory about managing people. David Langstaff, chief executive at TASC, T-A-S-C, that's all caps, whatever TASC is. It's a Chantilly-based government contracting firm, Chantilly, Virginia, put it in this way in a wonderful speech he gave at a recent conference in Chicago, hosted by the Aspen Institute at Northwestern University. If you are the sole proprietor of a business, do you think that you can motivate your employees for maximum performance by encouraging them simply to make more money for you? Of course not. But that is effectively what an enterprise is saying when it states that its purpose is to maximize profit for its investors. These days, in fact, economies have been scrambling to explain the recent slowdown in the pace of innovation and the growth in worker productivity. Is it possible it might have something to do with the fact that American workers now know that any benefit from their ingenuity or increased efficiency is destined to go to shareholders and top executives? The public certainly isn't buying the shareholder-first ideology. Polls by the Gallup organization show that people's trust and respect in big corporations has been on a long, slow decline in recent decades. Only Congress and health maintenance organizations are held in lower esteem. Wow, they didn't even think about polling on the popularity of HMOs. That's a good point. Okay. One of the rare corporate CEOs lionized on the cover of a News Weekly was the late Steve Jobs of Apple, who, as it happened, created more wealth for more shareholders than any corporate executive in history by putting shareholders near the bottom of his priorities. The defense you usually hear of maximizing shareholder value from chief executives is that most of them don't make the mistake of confusing this week's stock price with shareholder value. They are quick to acknowledge that no enterprise can maximize long-term value for its shareholders without attracting great employees, producing great products and services, and doing their part to support effective government and healthy communities. In short, they argue over the long term there is no inherent conflict between the interests of shareholders and those of other stakeholders. But if optimizing shareholder value requires taking care of customers, employees, and communities, Then, by the same logic, you could argue that maximizing customer satisfaction would, over the long term, require taking good care of shareholders, employees, and communities. And indeed, that is precisely the suggestion made long ago by Peter Drucker, the late great management guru. The purpose of business is to create and keep a customer, Drucker wrote. Martin argues it is no coincidence that companies have maintained a strong customer focus. Companies that have maintained a strong customer focus, think Apple, Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, they have consistently done better for their shareholders than companies which claim to put shareholders first. The reason is that customer focus minimizes undue risk-taking and maximizes reinvestment over the long run, creating a larger pie from which everyone benefits. The truth is that most executives would be thrilled if they could focus on customers rather than shareholders. In private, they chafe under the quarterly earnings regime forced on them by asset managers and the financial press. They fear and loathe activist investors who threaten them with takeovers, and they are disheartened by their low public esteem. If it were simply the law that was at fault, that would be relatively easy to change. Well, I don't know. Ask me again when we try to do it. Changing a behavioral norm, particularly one reinforced by so much supporting infrastructure, turns out to be much harder. Not that people aren't trying. A small and growing universe of socially responsible investing is made up of mutual funds, public and union pension funds, and research organizations that monitor corporate behavior and publish scorecards based on an assessment of how they treat customers, workers, the environment, and their communities. And a dozen states, including Virginia and Maryland and the district, which is not a state, we all know that, have recently established a new kind of corporate charter, the benefit corporation. We've talked about that explicitly commits companies to be managed for the benefit of all stakeholders. Hooray! The hope is that someday there will be a sufficient number of these B Corps, then they can be traded on their own exchange. The big challenge facing the corporate social responsibility movement, however, is that it exhibits an unmistakable liberal bias that makes it easy for academics, investment managers, and corporate executives to dismiss it as ideological and naive. As executives see it, running a big corporation, even for the long term, can involve making tough choices, such as laying off workers, reducing benefits, closing plants, or doing business in places where corruption is rampant or environmental regulations are weak. And as executives are quick to remind, companies that ignore short-term profitability run the risk of never making it to the long term. Among the growing chorus of critics of shareholder value, however, a consensus is emerging around a number of relatively modest changes in tax and corporate governance laws that could help lengthen time horizons and rebalance the focus of corporate decision-making. Among them here listed are 1, the capital gains tax. Oh my. All right. Capital gains tax could be recalibrated so that short-term trading profits are taxed the same as wages and salary, while gains from investment held for long periods are taxed more lightly than they are now, or not at all. Okay. A small transaction tax could also dampen enthusiasm for short-term trading. The Securities and Exchange Commission could adopt rules that discourage corporations from giving quarterly earnings projections or guidance, while accounting regulators could insist that corporate financial reports better reflect long-term costs and benefits and measure long-term value creation. Another idea here, states could make it easier for corporations to adopt governance rules that give long-term shareholders more power in selecting directors, approving mergers and takeovers, and settling executive compensation. The point of such reforms would not be to force companies to adopt a different focus or time horizon, but to give companies the ability to free themselves from the stranglehold of the short-term stock price. The hope would be that over time, the corporate ecosystem would become more heterogeneous, with different companies taking different approaches and adopting different priorities. In the end, the market, not just the stock market, but product markets and labor markets as well, would sort out which worked best. some of us don't always think that it does such a great job with these things. But okay, I get your point. Certainly, if you buy into that theory, then you ought to buy into every part of that theory. Lots of market here, not just the stock market to watch. Donald, if you're listening, and if you're listening, Russia, if you're listening, can you find the P-tape already? I'm waiting. All right. Anyway, my guess, not mine, but of course our author's guess, is that it will be a new generation of employees that finally frees the American corporation from the shareholder value straitjacket. Young people, oh my God, does this mean millennials are going to do something good? Hang on here, everybody. Young people, particularly those with skills that are in high demand, do millennials have those? I don't know. Can you code, dude? Other than that, I don't know what you got. Young people, particularly those with skills that are in high demand, today are drawn to work that not only pays well, but also has meaning and social value. As the economy improves and the baby boom generation retires, companies that have reputations as ruthless maximizers of short-term profits will find themselves on the losing end of the global competition for talent. In an era of plentiful capital, it will be skills, knowledge, creativity, and experience that will be in short supply, with those who have it setting the norms of corporate behavior. Who knows? It could even get to the point where executives, hedge fund managers, and financial colonists start agitating to free the economy from the tyranny of maximizing employee satisfaction. Well, don't hold your breath, but we do hope that day will come. All right, very interesting. I thought this was a great article to add to our collective database, I guess, of information and points and arguments that we've collected over the years about shareholder value versus stakeholder value. And, I'm glad to have found it in my exploration of things I put in pocket and forgot about. A continuing series. And now, time for a break for station identification. We'll be right back. I want to turn now to a piece that actually is referenced. It's linked in the previous piece about maximizing shareholder value, right up at the top, and led me to another article that I thought, again, this belongs in our roundup. Let's use it as an accompanying piece here. Only slightly earlier in the date of publication, August 26th, 2013, so nearing 4 years on the day. Maximizing shareholder value, the goal that changed corporate America. Well, thought I'd take a look at this one. Jia Lin Yang is the author on this piece. Let's just dive right in. This town in the hills of upstate New York is best known as the birthplace of IBM, one of the country's most iconic companies, but there remain only hints of that storied past. The main street, once swarming with International Business Machine's employees in their signature white shirts and dark suits, is dotted with empty storefronts. During the 1980s, there were 10,000 IBM workers in Endicott. Now, after years of layoffs and jobs shipped overseas, about 700 employees are left. Investors in IBM's shares, by contrast, have fared much better. IBM makes up the biggest portion of the benchmark Dow Jones Industrial Average and has helped drive that index to record highs. Someone who spent about $16,000 buying 1,000 shares of IBM in 1980 would now be sitting on more than $400,000 worth of stock, a 25-fold return. It used to be a given that the interests of corporations and communities such as Endicott were closely aligned, but no more. Across the United States, as companies continue posting record profits, workers face high unemployment and stagnant wages. Driving this change is a deep-seated belief that took hold in corporate America a few decades ago and has come to define today's economy, that a company's primary purpose is to maximize shareholder value. The belief that shareholders come first is not codified by statute. Rather, it was introduced by a handful of free market academics in the 1970s and then picked up by business leaders and the media until it became an oft-repeated mantra in the corporate world. Together with the new competition overseas, the pressure to respond to the short-term demands of Wall Street has paved the way for an economy in which companies are increasingly disconnected from the state of the nation, laying off workers in huge waves, keeping average wages low and threatening to move operations abroad in the face of regulations and taxes. This all presents a quandary for policymakers trying to combat joblessness and raise the fortunes of lower and middle-income Americans. Proposals by President Obama and lawmakers on Capitol Hill to change corporate tax policy, for instance, are aimed at the margins of company behavior when compared with the overwhelming drive to maximize shareholder wealth. This shift in what employers think of as their role, not just in the community, but relative to their workforce, is quite radical, and I think it has led to the last two jobless recoveries, said Ron Hira, an associate professor of public policy at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Hey, Rochester, how you doing? The change can be seen in statements from IBM's leaders over the years. When he was IBM's president and chief executive, Thomas J. Watson, Jr., son of the company's founder, spoke explicitly about balancing a company's interests with the country's. Current chief executive Virginia Rometty, and I don't know whether she's still current, but back in 2013 anyway, has pledged to follow a plan called the 2015 Roadmap, in which the primary goal is to dramatically raise the company's earnings per share figure, a metric favored by Wall Street. Job cuts have come this summer, the biggest wave in years at the company. In Essex Junction, Vermont, about 450 workers were axed in June. In Dutchess County, New York, 700 jobs were lost. At Endicott, at least 15 workers were told to leave. Retired software developer Linda Geyer saw the change over her 29-year career. In the beginning, it was a wonderful place to work. Maybe the way Google is today, really innovative, said Geyer, 59, who used to work for IBM in Endicott. But after training her overseas replacements and then being pushed into early retirement, Geyer said, "You end up feeling really cynical. I can only imagine." In 2009, IBM stopped breaking out how many workers it has in the United States versus other countries. The company, based in Armonk, New York, probably began employing more workers in India than in this country around the same time, according to analysis by Dave Feingold, a professor at the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. Many things have changed over the years about IBM, which has one of the oldest continuous histories of any company in the world. The firm that pioneered the floppy disk, an early version of the ATM, and one of the earliest best-selling PCs, now makes nearly as much money selling consulting services as it does software. Defenders argue that the company has had to reinvent itself so many times to stay alive that the values of Watson are no longer as easy to apply as they used to be. Doug Shelton, a spokesman for IBM, said that globalization and increased competition make it hard to compare the company with its earlier days under Watson, and that it still has the biggest and most talented technology workforce in the world. Shelton said the company's headcount has expanded every year since 2002, and that it's hiring for positions across the United States. Change is a constant in the technology industry, Shelton said in a statement. IBM is investing in growth areas for the future: big data, cloud computing, social business, and the growing mobile computing opportunity. The company has always invested in transformational areas, and as a result, we must remix our skills so IBM can lead in these higher value segments in both emerging markets and in more mature economies. The cultural shifts in corporate America have not changed only IBM. The company is merely a representative of what has happened at most large globalized U.S. firms, but some experts wonder whether these companies have gone too far, leaving the rest of the country behind. We don't build companies to serve Wall Street, said Margaret Blair, a professor at Vanderbilt Law School. We build corporations to provide goods and services to a society and jobs for people. In the decades after World War II, as the U.S. economy boomed, the interests of companies, shareholders, society, and workers appeared to be in tune. Towns such as Endicott flourished. Even until 1981, the Business Roundtable trade group understood the need to balance these different stakeholders. Corporations have a responsibility, first of all, to make available to the public quality goods and services at fair prices, thereby earning a profit that attracts investment to continue and enhance the enterprise, provide jobs, and build the economy, the group said at the time in a document cited this year, 2013, of course, in an article in the publication Daedalus. It continued, "The long-term viability of the corporation depends upon its responsibility to the society of which it is a part, and the well-being of society depends upon profitable and responsible business enterprises." But changes were already afoot in the academic world that would reshape the fundamental relationship between this country and its companies. Lynn Stout, a professor of corporate and business law at Cornell University Law School, traces the transformation to the rise of the Chicago School of Free Market Economists. Yes, I think you're largely correct about that. Of course, I learned all about that in George Mason University Law School. And by that time, of course, it was largely a given everywhere, but it was certainly a given in the law and economics curriculum that they taught at George Mason, that the purpose of a corporation was to maximize shareholder value. There was no doubting that. And there's very little doubting it in most business schools. I'll continue with the article here. In 1970, Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman wrote an article in the New York Times Magazine, damn you, New York Times, in which he famously argued that the only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. Then, in 1976, economists Michael Jensen and William Meckling published a paper saying that shareholders were principals who hired executives and board members as agents. In other words, when you are an executive or corporate director, you work for the shareholders. Stout said these legal theories appealed to the media. The idea that shareholders were king simplifies the confusing debate over the purpose of a corporation. More powerfully, it helped spawn the rise of executive pay tied to share prices, and thus the huge rise in stock option pay. As a result, average annual executive pay has quadrupled since the early 1970s. Part of this was backlash to the dismal performance of the stock market during the 1970s, a decade that brought negative returns for investors. There was also the perception that companies, including IBM, had become lax in their management. Pressing executives to boost their returns created a new kind of accountability, just as the economy was becoming more globalized and more competitive. The shift was dramatic. By 1997, the Business Roundtable had a new statement, also unearthed in this Daedalus article. It stated that the principal objective of a business enterprise is to generate economic returns to its owners, and that if the CEO and the directors are not focused on shareholder value, it may be less likely the corporation will realize that value. The mantra that executives and corporate board members have a duty to maximize shareholder value has become so ingrained that many people assume it must be codified somewhere. And it's, in some places, as good as codified. One of the things that I'd like to discuss after this is the efforts that Chicago school people and law and economics operators essentially have the efforts that they've put into training federal judges to think this way. If they weren't taught this in business school and law school in a business course that they took in college, if they missed this or this didn't get drilled in or they didn't know how to apply it when they were applying the federal law in their cases, you can be taught how to do that and how to think like that, complete with delicious steak dinners and fabulous golf vacations. They'll whisk you away, all expenses paid, and give you a mini vacation so long as, instead of coming by to hear about the opportunities in buying timeshare condominiums, you have to come by and listen to the opportunities to apply law and economics theory such that it becomes a matter of law for judges trained this way that the purpose of a corporation is to maximize shareholder value. If you were ever wondering about the tremendous success that shareholder derivative suits had in the 80s, the 90s, into the well past 2000, and how quickly those numbers began to rack up, not to mention how quickly executive pay and corporate control of almost everything began to ratchet up as they amassed more and more money. A lot of the fault in that, I think, lies in training judges to think that they were applying the law, though they weren't, or at least applying some logical extension of the law or some logical framework within which to interpret the law. And it is a logical framework. It's just not the only one, but it's taught as though it were. It's very interesting. And maybe it's something that you can't quite convey without having had a chance to sit in those classrooms and be taught that. But I would venture to say that the largest part of our audience has heard that said and has been taught exactly that. And they may have had offered some resistance to it or modified the formulation of it over the years. But I'll bet that almost everybody has been told flatly that that is the purpose of a corporation at some point. So where were we with this? It became so ingrained that many people must assume it must be codified somewhere. But legal experts say there is no statute in state or federal law requiring corporations and executives to maximize shareholder value. Blair, the professor at Vanderbilt, said that courts, in fact, allow wide latitude for managers and directors when it comes to business decisions. That's true, too. We have discussed that. Let me be clear that this pressure comes from the media, from shareholder advocates and financial institutions in whose direct interest it is for the company to get its share price to go up, Blair said in testimony before a House hearing in 2008. And from the self-imposed pressure created by compensation packages that provide enormous potential rewards for directors and managers if stock prices go up. Some who defend the use of shareholder value as a measuring stick for corporate success argue that with retirees depending on stocks, whether through pension funds or 401ks, rising share prices benefit more than just Wall Street. If you stick it to the equity holders, you're going to stick it to the retirees, said Charles Elson, director of the John L. Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance at the University of Delaware. Witness the names, by the way, given to the endowed chairs at some of these institutions, if you want to know where they might be coming from in teaching their students. A chair for corporate governance. I mean, it's a good idea. You might want to look into who John L. Weinberg is. I don't know. But anyway, let's move on here. Like the Business Roundtable statements that changed over time, the message from companies such as IBM shifted as well. Watson published a seminal text in 1963 called A Business and Its Beliefs, the Ideas That Helped Build IBM. In it, he wrote that IBM's philosophy could be contained in 3 beliefs. 1, the most important, was respect for the individual employee. The second, a commitment to customer service. And third, achieving excellence. He wrote that balancing profits between the well-being of employees and the nation's interest is a necessary duty for companies. Watson took pride in the fact that his father avoided layoffs even during the Great Depression. We acknowledge our obligation as a business institution to help improve the quality of the society we are a part of, read the text of IBM's corporate values. Under Watson's watch, IBM introduced groundbreaking computers that shot his father's company to the top of the technology world. Even into the 1980s, there was a saying that IBM's products were so reliable, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. But by the time Louis V. Gerstner Jr. took over IBM in the early 1990s, the company was in trouble. Its main advantage in the PC business was eroding, and expenses were high compared to those of competitors. Months into his tenure, Gerstner cut about 60,000 workers. At the time, one of the biggest layoffs at a U.S. corporation. In 1994, Gerstner outlined his own set of 8 principles, a clear break from the old document. Near the top was that the company's primary measures of success were shareholder value and customer satisfaction. The last one, we are sensitive to the needs of all employees and to the communities in which we operate. Sensitive to them, we just maybe don't care what happens. I'm sensitive to it. I felt it. I just not going to really let that guide my decision making. But I'm sensitive. Gerstner pulled off a turnaround considered legendary by those who study business history. The culture at IBM was irrevocably changed too. The chief executives who followed Gerstner have pushed the company hard to hit ambitious financial targets designed to please analysts on Wall Street. In the process, the iconic IBM charted a path that other companies have followed. One of the most influential changes took place in 1999 when IBM overhauled its pension plan under Gerstner to help cut costs, shocking longtime employees. Geyer, the former IBM software developer, said she still remembers the surprise of getting a letter in the mail showing her cash balance for retirement after about 2 decades at the company was $30,000. It was like, oh my God, we've been totally ripped off, she said. IBM employees later filed a class action lawsuit over the pension changes. In 2004, the company agreed to pay $320 million to current and former employees in a settlement. William Lazonick, an expert on industrial competitiveness at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, said the pension plan change was a watershed moment. IBM was a critical company because everybody after that said, if IBM is going in that direction, we'll all go in that direction, Lazonick said. By 2000, really the whole system had changed. The company has continued tinkering with its retirement benefits. Late last year, it changed its 401k contribution policy so that IBM matches employees' savings just once a year rather than throughout the year. The company said it was making the change to stay competitive, but the new plan also means that employees who lose their jobs before a set date in December do not see any of the matching funds. Nice trick. Since Gerstner's time running the company, the pressure to please shareholders has only ratcheted up. Samuel J. Palmisano, chief executive from 2002 to 2011, charted new goals in 2010, calling the plan IBM's 2015 roadmap. The primary objective, nearly doubling earnings per share to $20. IBM's current chief executive, Ramadi, has picked up where Palmisano left off. The company's 2012 annual report notes that the company's roadmap delivers long-term value and performance for all key IBM stakeholders, investors, clients, employees, and society. But as sales flatten, questions have emerged about how the company will hit its ambitious target aside from slashing jobs. This is a horrible business model, said Lee Conrad, a coordinator for Alliance at IBM, a group that advocates for company employees. It's all about the EPS, earnings per share, and not about growing the business. The customers are being impacted by this when good employees are being cut. It's just a mess. Geyer said everyone in the office used to have a copy of Watson's manifesto on IBM's principles, the one that says respect for the individual came first. The company had its own printing press, so it was easy to get the book. By the time she left, she did not see the book around as much. She remembers rescuing one from a trash can once, and her copy, it's stored in her garage somewhere, a bittersweet souvenir from her corporate career. Here's yet another entry from the Trump lies about everything all the time, no matter that there's no reason whatsoever for even concocting a lie, files. A lie that was one of the many hundreds that we haven't covered even on this show. It's just sort of struck me The debunking of the lie caught my eye, and it was only in the debunking that I realized that he even uttered this completely ridiculous lie. Donald Trump's tall tales about the 21 Club. Did you even take note of this one? This is reported by page6.com, which I guess is the successor website to the Page 6 gossip columns where Trump practically spent his life in the 1980s and 1990s. It was to the Page 6 tabloid gossip columns that he was constantly bragging as John Barron or John Miller about his own sexual exploits, in case you were wondering where the Page 6 name came from. But I didn't even notice this lie until it was debunked. Richard Johnson is the name of the guy writing for Page 6 here. President Trump, while berating his top generals about losing the war in Afghanistan, that's his words, that he was losing the war, told a story about the renovation of the 21 Club that was completely wrong in every detail, both the former owner and former CEO of the Landmark restaurant told me. Marshall Kogan, who owned 21 from 1985 to 1995, told me, "I have no idea what was in his head. I never have." Ken Aretsky, the restaurant's CEO from 1986 to 1995, said, once again, Trump exaggerated another story. NBC News, they were the ones that reported that Trump had told his national security advisors that 21 had shut its doors for a year and then hired an expensive consultant to plan the renovation. The consultant's only suggestion was a bigger kitchen. The clear message, if you heard the story, was high-priced consultants or high-priced anybody, expensive, supposedly big-brained people, but who are physically far from the source of the problem, often give you much worse advice than the supposedly low-ranking guys who are right there, an unnamed official said. That's the reason that Trump bothers. Can you imagine wasting National Security Council time with a story about this restaurant that I used to go to in New York? It was fantastic. It had all the hottest people. Shut up already. Can you give us any kind of indication that you understand what's really happening here now? No, I only know about that. New York City in the 1980s. That's where my brain is. So that's what this story is about. But, according to Page 6, like Aretsky, the guy who used to run the restaurant, says there was no consultant, and the renovation in 1987 took less than 6 months. I signed all the checks. We didn't make any mistakes. The kitchens were 60 years old. We put in all new equipment and ductwork. Kogan said there was no consultant at all. We had architectural firm Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. 21 was sold to Orient Express Hotels in 95, and Aretsky opened Patroon on East 46th Street the following year. Kogan said it was a wonderful transaction. We made a fair New England return. Trump, I don't even know what they're talking about, but who cares? Trump was a regular at 21, but not such a frequent patron that he had his own table. Aretsky said he and his family, Trump and his family, celebrated his victory there after the election. I'm proud of the job I did at 21, and I got a great kick out of reading about Trump's comparison of our renovation to the war in Afghanistan, but everything he said is wrong. Kogan said, I think Trump has a psychological problem that only a therapist can define for you. I can't. What a story. Another totally unnecessary, totally amazing, totally ridiculous lie with no benefit whatsoever for having told it. It was illustrative of nothing. It educated no one about anything, even as a lie, and it gained him absolutely nothing. It just exposed him as a liar again. Literally no reason for it. Just thought I'd throw that one in there to keep you up to date on the things he lies about and how often he does it. And now, time for another break for station identification. We'll be right back. Here's another piece that might make a nice companion to the earlier pieces, having had our update on what Trump is up to these days. Also dug out of the archives from 2013, right around the same time. September 20th, 2013, a piece in Salon by Edward McClelland, R.I.P., rest in peace, R.I.P., the middle class, I guess declared dead in 2013. Dates given here, 1946 to 2013. The 1% hollowed out the middle class and our industrial base, and Washington just let it happen, says McClellan. The article begins this way. I know I'm dating myself by writing this, but I remember the middle class. I grew up in an automaking town in the 1970s when it was still possible for a high school graduate or even a high school dropout to get a job on an assembly line and earn more money than a high school teacher, which just goes to show you that even in the 1970s we had that backwards. But okay, I had this student, my history teacher once told me, a real chucklehead, just refused to study, dropped out of school. A year or so later he came back to see me. He pointed out the window at a brand new Camaro and said, "That's my car." Meanwhile, I was driving a beat-up station wagon. I think he was an electrician's assistant or something. He handed light bulbs to an electrician. In our neighbors' driveways, in their living rooms, in their backyards, I saw the evidence of prosperity distributed equally among the social classes. Speedboats, Corvette Stingrays, waterbeds, snowmobiles, motorcycles, hunting rifles, RVs, CB radios. I've always believed that the 70s are remembered as the decade that taste forgot because they were a time when people without culture or education had the money to not only indulge their passions, but flaunt them in front of the entire nation. It was an era, to use the title of a 1975 sociological study of a Wisconsin tavern, of blue-collar aristocrats. That all began to change in the 1980s. The recession at the beginning of that decade, America's first Great Recession, was the beginning of the end for the bourgeois proletariat. Steel workers showed up for first shift to find padlocks on mill gates. Auto workers were laid off for years. The lucky ones were transferred to plants far from home. The unlucky never built another car. When I was growing up, it was assumed that America's shared prosperity was the natural end point of our economy's development, that capitalism had produced the workers' paradise to which communism unsuccessfully aspired. Now, with the perspective of 40 years, it's obvious that the non-stop economic expansion that lasted from the end of World War II to the Arab oil embargo of 1973 was a historical fluke, made possible by the fact that the United States was the only country to emerge from that war with its industrial capacity intact. Unfortunately, the middle class, especially the blue-collar middle class, is also starting to look like a fluke, an interlude between gilded ages that more closely reflect the way most societies structure themselves economically. For the majority of human history, and in the majority of countries today, there have been only two classes, aristocracy and peasantry. It's an order in which the many toil for subsistence wages to provide luxuries for the few. 20th century America temporarily escaped this stratification, but now, as statistics on economic inequality demonstrate, we're slipping back in that direction. Between 1970 and today, the share of the nation's income that went to the middle class, households earning 2/3 to double the national median, fell from 62% to 45%. Last year, and that would have been 2012, the wealthiest 1% took in 19% of America's income, their highest share since 1928. What happened in 1928? It's as though the New Deal and the modern labor movement never happened. Here's the story of a couple whose working lives began during the golden age of middle-class employment and are ending in this current age of inequality. Gary Gallipeau, I'm going to guess is the pronunciation there, Gallipeau. Gary Gallipeau was born in Syracuse, New York, in the baby boom sweet spot of 1948. At age 19, he hired in at his hometown's flagship business, the Carrier Corporation, which gave Syracuse the title Air Conditioning Capital of the World. Starting at $2.37 an hour, Gallipeau worked his way into the skilled trades, eventually becoming a metal fabricator, earning 10 times his original wage. Understand, he said, In the mid-'60s, you could figuratively roll out of bed and find a manufacturing job. Voss joined Carrier after dropping out of Syracuse University and getting laid off from an industrial laundry. It was 1978, she said. You could still go from factory to factory. One day, a friend and I were looking for a job, and we saw this big building. We said, must be jobs in there. In those days, you could fill out an application and get an interview the same day. I was offered a job within 3 or 4 days making window units. I sprayed glue on fiberglass insulation, stuck it inside units, 400 a day, nearly one a minute. I was told, after 5 years, you'll have a job for life. You'll be golden. Gallipo and Voss, who met working at Carrier, lost their jobs in 2004 when the company moved the last of its Syracuse manufacturing operations to Singapore. There, even the most skilled workers were paid half the $27 an hour Gallipo had earned as a metal worker. The corporation they'd expected to spend their careers with divorced them in middle age, and now they had to bridge the years until Social Security and Medicare. Eligible for trade adjustment assistance because her job had moved overseas, Voss earned a 2-year degree in health information technology, a fancy way of saying medical records. Even with the degree, Voss couldn't find decent paying work in healthcare, so she took a job with a sump pump manufacturer for $12.47 an hour, a substantial drop from Carrier, but decent money for central New York in the AD of AC. The number one employer of ex-Carrier workers, by the way, is an Iroquois casino right now. Less than 2 weeks into the new job, a thread on Voss's work glove wrapped itself around a drill press, taking Voss's finger with it. The digit was torn off at the first knuckle. When Voss returned to work 2 months later, she found the factory so distressing that she soon took a medical records job in a hospital, paying $2.50 an hour less. After earning a degree in human resources management, Gallipo found that 56 was too old to start a new career. Fortunate enough to draw a full pension from Carrier, Gallipo took a part-time job at a supermarket meat counter for the health insurance. Syracuse's leading vocations are now education and medicine, the training of the young and the preservation of the old. Where nothing is left for the middle-aged or the middle class, it's difficult to be both. The shrinking of the middle class is not a failure of capitalism, it's a failure of government. Capitalism has been doing exactly what it was designed to do, concentrating wealth in the ownership class while providing the mass of workers with just enough wages to feed, house, and clothe themselves. Young people who graduate from college to $9.80 an hour jobs as sales clerks or data processors are giving up on the concept of employment as a vehicle for improving their financial fortunes. In a recent survey, 24% defined the American dream as not being in debt. They're not trying to get ahead, they're just trying to get to zero. That's the natural drift of the relationship between capital and labor, and it can only be arrested by an activist government that chooses to step in as a referee. The organizing victories that founded the modern union movement were made possible by the National Labor Relations Act, a piece of New Deal legislation guaranteeing workers the right to bargain collectively. The plotters of the 1936-37 Flint sit-down strike, which gave birth to the United Auto Workers, tried to time their action to coincide with the inauguration of Frank Murphy, Michigan's newly elected New Deal governor. Murphy dispatched the National Guard to Flint, but instead of ordering his guardsmen to throw the workers out of the plants, as he legally could have done, he ordered them to ensure the workers remained safely inside. The strike resulted in a nickel-an-hour raise and an end to arbitrary firings. It guaranteed the success of the UAW, whose high wages and benefits set the standard for American workers for the next 45 years. I know a sit-down striker who died on September 17th at 98 years old, an age he might not have attained without the lifetime health benefits won by the UAW. The United States will never again be as wealthy as it was in the 1950s and 60s. Never again will 18-year-olds graduate directly from high school to jobs that pay well enough to buy a house and support a family. Even the auto plants now demand a few years in junior college. That was inevitable due to the recovery of our World War II enemies and automation that enables 5,000 workers to build the same number of cars that once required 25,000 hands. What was not inevitable was the federal government withdrawing its supervision of the economy at the precise moment Americans began to need it more than at any time since the Great Depression. The last president who had a plan for protecting American workers from the vicissitudes of the global economy was Richard Nixon, who was in office when foreign steel and foreign cars began seriously competing with domestic products. The most far-sighted politician of his generation, Nixon realized that America's economic hegemony was coming to an end and was determined to cushion a decline by A, preventing foreign manufacturers from overrunning our markets, and B, teaching Americans to live within their new limits. When the United States began running a trade deficit, Nixon tried to reverse the trend with a 10% tariff on imported products. After the 1973 Arab oil embargo suddenly increased the price of gasoline from 36 cents to 53 cents a gallon, and just as suddenly increased the demand for fuel-efficient German and Japanese cars, Nixon lowered the speed limit to 55 miles an hour and introduced the corporate average fuel economy law, which gave automakers until 1985 to double their fleet-wide fuel efficiency to 27.5 miles per gallon. Had Nixon survived Watergate, he might have set the nation on a course that emphasized government regulation of the economy and trade protection as a response to globalism. We might also have preserved more of the manufacturing base necessary for a strong middle class, but his successors dismantled that vision, beginning with Jimmy Carter, an economically conservative Southern planter. Nixon's answer to inflation had been wage and price controls, an intrusion into the free market that would be unimaginable today. Carter deregulated the airlines, rail, and trucking industries, hoping that competition would result in lower prices. It didn't. But it gave the newly liberated companies more leverage against their unions. When inflation nonetheless reached 14%, Carter's hand-picked Federal Reserve Board Chairman, Paul Volcker, responded by tightening the money supply, raising interest rates so high that Americans could not afford loans for cars or houses. Ronald Reagan also chose low prices over employment, refusing to free up money until inflation declined. Car sales hit a 20-year low. In the fall of 1982, the national unemployment rate was 10.8%, the highest since the Great Depression. Walter Mondale accused Reagan of turning the Midwest into a rust bowl, a term reformulated to Rust Belt. Buffalo, Cleveland, Flint, and Detroit still haven't recovered. Neither has the middle class. You can't grow an economy, grow a middle class without making things, producing stuff, says Mike Stout, a steel worker who lost his job when Pennsylvania's Homestead Works closed in 1986. It's just impossible. I haven't seen it anywhere. Reagan also fired the striking members of the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization. He argued that he was simply trying to end an illegal strike by public employees, but his action encouraged private employers to use the same tactic. Once workers realized they could lose their jobs by joining a picket line, the number of strikes dropped tenfold from 300 a year before 1981 to 30 a year today. Pre-PATCO, that's the acronym for the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, pre-PATCO, 21% of workers belonged to unions, still down from the all-time high of 30%. Now, fewer than 12% do. Union membership is at 14.7 million, the lowest since just before World War II. There's a well-known graph that shows middle-class income share declining along the same axis as unionization. Bill Clinton continued down the same deregulatory path, signing the North American Free Trade Agreement and the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which prohibited commercial banks from owning investment firms. NAFTA, which resulted in hundreds of small manufacturers moving to Mexico, was passed over the vehement objections of labor. In 1994, Representative Glenn Pochard of Illinois tried to persuade the Labor Department to intervene in a lockout at the A.E. Staley Manufacturing Company, a Decatur cornstarch manufacturer that had been bought by Tate & Lyle, a London-based food conglomerate. Pochard, I'm not sure whether it's Pochard or Pochard. How would you say it? How did you say it? Someone probably remembers him. Pochard considered the dispute the flashpoint for a new economic globalism of the 1990s. But when he took a group of workers to meet Labor Secretary Robert Reich, the secretary gave no indication the federal government would try to settle the matter. After 2.5 years, the union capitulated, settling for a third of its pre-lockout jobs. Only in 2008, after the bubble of false prosperity created by easy credit and inflated housing values blew up, did two presidents finally take an active role in the economy. George W. Bush decided he didn't want to be remembered as the president who allowed American automakers to fall apart, and sent them $17.4 billion of the $700 billion Wall Street bailout money. Barack Obama finished the job, setting up an auto task force to guide General Motors and Chrysler through bankruptcy. He did so over the objections of his House Clintonite Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel. Emanuel's response to the prospect of tens of thousands of auto workers losing their jobs? F the UAW. Of course, he used the full word there. Even so, new auto workers now start at $14 an hour, hardly a middle-class wage. Obama also passed the Affordable Care Act, the most significant piece of social welfare legislation since the Great Society. But author Peter Beinart still thinks Obama belongs to the modern tradition of small government presidents, calling his politics pro-capitalist, anti-bureaucratic, Reaganized liberalism. The lesson of the last 40 years is that we can't depend on the free market to sustain a middle class. It's not going to happen without government intervention. Even when American industry dominated the world, one reason workers prospered was that the economy operated on New Deal underpinnings, which included legal protections for labor unions, government regulation of industry, and high marginal income tax rates. It's time to declare an end to the deregulatory experiment that has resulted in the greatest disparity between the top earners and the middle earners in nearly a century. Now that the New Deal has been vanquished, a goal conservatives have cherished since before Robert Taft went extinct, we need a newer deal that will raise the minimum wage, reduce obstacles to union organizing, levy higher taxes on passive wealth such as investments and inheritances, and provide benefits for workers unable to obtain it at their jobs, perhaps by lowering Medicaid eligibility or instituting a single-payer health system. I think if we just say we want a single-payer health system, Greg will largely agree that it will just appear of its own volition, I think. Anyway, the demand for such reforms is brewing. We heard from the middle class during the Occupy movement of 2011 and from the lower class in this year's fast food strikes. Remember, we're back in 2013 here, and also pre-Trump election. Not long ago, I was in Flint, Michigan, to meet with its new congressman, Dan Kildee. No American city has suffered more during the age of deregulation than Flint. In 1978, Flint had 80,000 automaking jobs and the highest per capita income in the nation. Today, it has 6,000 automaking jobs and the highest murder rate in the English-speaking world. Instead of Corvettes and speedboats, the yards are filled with mean dogs. This property protected by Smith & Wesson signs and weeds. So far, Kildee's biggest achievement has been securing federal funding to tear down 2,000 abandoned houses. In Flint, where the average home sale price is $15,000, eliminating blight increases property values. Having seen the consequences of government indifference, Kildee wants to return to the days of government activism. As county treasurer, he founded a public land bank that helped revive downtown Flint by purchasing and renovating a hotel that had sat empty since 1973. It's a myth that there is any market that is not supported or affected by the structure of government in one way or another, he said. We're picking winners and losers right now, and we're picking the wrong ones. We're making matters worse by not intervening in these communities. It's not fine for Flint to be one of the losers, as far as I'm concerned. And our author concludes, as far as I'm concerned, it's not fine for the middle class to be one of the losers either. Very interesting, and a strident defense, of course, of the interests of the middle class. And it's funny, it's not that funny, but it's interesting anyway to take this look back at the way Flint is described pre-water crisis, or at least pre-discovery of the water crisis anyway. That would now, I think, rank as number one in anybody's list of Flint's problems, though certainly the unemployment and urban blight remain high on anyone's list. It's just kind of amazing how you can pile problems on top of problems and the way these things cascade upon one another. One more trip way back in our archives, and way back even further than our archives actually extend. An article in the original days of my use of Pocket that was old already when I added it to Pocket. This goes back to the September-October 2009 issue of Mother Jones magazine. And I don't know, this sort of caps off a look back through the archives of Pocket. We'll continue to do that throughout the week from time to time. Has nothing in particular to do with the economic inequality issues we've touched on so far, though it does touch on some other ones. This is, I guess, one of those evergreen bits that some of you probably knew already, and I just thought I would share with you one day, and that day has finally come around. Fiji Water. It's good stuff, by the way, but I guess, like everything else that's good, you can't have nice things. There's always something terrible behind something as simple as nice water. Anna Lenzner put this together. Fiji Water, spin the bottle, as she calls it. Obama sips it. This is in the subtitle here. Obama sips it. Paris Hilton loves it. Mary J. Blige won't sing without it. How did a plastic water bottle imported from a military dictatorship, thousands of miles away, become the epitome of cool? Starts this way. The internet cafe in the Fijian capital, Suva, was usually open all night long. Dimly lit with rows of sleek modern terminals, the place was packed at all hours with teenage boys playing boisterous rounds of video games. But one day soon after I arrived, the staff told me they now had to shut down by 5 p.m. Police orders, they shrugged. The country's military junta had declared martial law a few days before, and things were a bit tense. I sat down and sent out a few emails, filling friends in on my visit to the Fiji Water bottling plant, forwarding a story about foreign journalists being kicked off the island. Then my connection died. It'll just be a few minutes, one of the clerks said. Moments later, a pair of police officers walked in. They headed for a woman at another terminal. I turned to my screen to compose a note about how cops were even showing up in the internet cafes, and then I saw them coming toward me. We're going to take you in for questioning about the emails you've been writing, they said. What followed in a windowless room at the main police station felt like a bad cop movie. Who are you really? The bespectacled inspector wearing a khaki uniform and a smug grin asked me over and over, as if my passport, press credentials, and stacks of notes about Fiji Water weren't sufficient clues to my identity. My iPod, he surmised tensely, was good for transmitting information. I asked him to call my editors, even a UN official who could vouch for me. "Shut up," he snapped. He rifled through my bags, read my notebooks and emails. "I'd hate to see a young lady like you go into a jail full of men," he averred, smiling grimly. "You know what happened to women during the 2000 coup, don't you?" I don't, but I can imagine it's not very pleasant, let's say. Eventually, it dawned on me that his concern wasn't just with my potentially seditious emails. He was worried that my reporting would taint the Fiji Water brand. "Who do you work for? Another water company? It would be good to come here and try to take away Fiji Water's business, wouldn't it?" Then he switched tacks and offered to protect me from other Fijian officials, who he said would soon be after me, by letting me go so I could leave the country. I walked out into the muggy morning, hid in a stairwell, and called a Fijian friend. Within minutes, a U.S. Embassy van was speeding toward me on the seawall. Until that day, I hadn't fully appreciated the paranoia of Fiji's military regime. The junta had been declared unconstitutional the previous week by the country's second highest court. In response, it had abolished the judiciary, banned unauthorized public gatherings, delayed elections until 2014, and clamped down on the media. Only the journalism of hope is now permitted, whatever that might mean. The Prime Minister, Commodore Frank, oh my goodness, I knew I would get into this, Frank Bainimarama is my best guess on that one, promised to root out corruption and bring democracy to a country that had seen 4 coups in the past 25 years. The government said it will start working on a new constitution in 2012. We should check back in on them to see how they did. The slogan on Fiji Water's website, and remember this, "We saved you a trip to Fiji," suddenly felt like a dark joke. Every day, more soldiers showed up on the streets. When I called the courthouse, not a single official would give me his name. Even tour guides were running scared. One told me that one of his colleagues had been picked up and beaten for talking politics with tourists. When I later asked Fiji Water spokesman Rob Six what the company thought of all this, he said the policy was not to comment on the government unless something really affects us. If you drink bottled water, you've probably drunk Fiji, or wanted to, even though it's shipped from the opposite end of the globe, even though it retails for nearly 3 times as much as your basic supermarket water. Fiji is now America's leading imported water, beating out Evian. It has spent millions pushing not only the seemingly life-changing properties of the product itself, but also the company's green cred and its charity work. Put all that together in an iconic bottle emblazoned with a cheerful hibiscus, and everybody from the Obamas to Paris and Nicole to Diddy and Kimura is seen sipping Fiji. Time now for us to take one last break for station identification. And we are back from break and ready to head into the final stretch of our show for the day. When we last left off, we were reading about Fiji Water and its enormous popularity with celebrities in the United States, and you've likely caught on to that. We were just discussing at the end of or at the beginning of the break, from the Obamas to Paris to Nicole to Diddy and Kimura, everyone was seen sipping Fiji, and I was puzzled at the end there. Kimura, I'm just not that cool. I think I lost track of who our celebrities were there. But anyway, the whole strategy of having everyone drink the Fiji water is, of course, part of the marketing design. And by the way, I wanted to let everybody know. Obviously, you've figured this out probably by now. You might have taken a double take here. We took a little break. Took advantage of the station ID break in our taping to listen to the show to this point and realized our levels are way off on the microphones. So we've got it repaired. So hopefully the end of the show is a little more easy to listen to, and hopefully you won't have to turn your volume too far up just to catch up with us. Anyway, as we were saying, all the celebrities were drinking Fiji water and fixing their microphones. That's by design, the article continues. Ever since a Canadian mining and real estate mogul named David Gilmour launched Fiji Water in 1995, the company has positioned itself squarely at the nexus of pop culture, glamour, and progressive politics. Fiji Water's chief marketing whiz and co-owner, with her husband Stuart, is Linda Resnick, a well-known liberal donor who casually name-drops her friends Ariana Huffington and Laurie David. Of course I know everyone in the world, Resnick told the UK's Observer in 2005, every mogul, every movie star. Manhattan's trendy Carlisle Hotel pours only Fiji water in its dog bowls, and this year's South by Southwest Music Festival featured a Fiji water detox spa. Each piece of lobster sashimi, celebrity chef Nobu Matsuhisa declared in 2007, should be dipped into Fiji water 7 to 10 times. A rather extravagant ritual, to be sure. Nobu came up a couple of weeks ago. He was one of the celebrity judges at the 2013 Moscow Miss Universe pageant. How interesting that we should see him again. And, as I'm reading it, Linda Resnick's name now rings a bell, and I realize that is the name I think we'll discover later on, probably in the article. Aren't they water hogs in California as well? I think they're behind the pistachio growers and a number of other agricultural endeavors that are enormous water hogs. What an interesting person, single-handedly killing the water on the planet. And tight with all the progressives and pop stars too. Not a really super good look there. Really, well, it's too bad. I mean, honestly, I do like Fiji water. It tastes great as far as water goes, but I don't get to have it that often. It's usually when a hotel is giving it away. Now I feel bad about it. Well, anyway, even as bottled water in general has come under attack as the embodiment of waste, it's true, we'll have to admit that. Most of you are already there, I'm sure. Fiji seems immune, or at least it did way back when this was written. Fiji Water took out a full-page ad in Vanity Fair's 2007 Green issue, nestled among stories about the death of the world's water. 2 bottles sat on a table between Al Gore and Mos Def during a 2006 MySpace artist-on-artist discussion on climate change. Fiji was what panelists sipped at the Life After Capitalism conference held in New York City during the 2004 RNC protests. Fiji reps were even credentialed at last year's Democratic Convention, where they handed out tens of thousands of bottles. Nowhere in Fiji Water's glossy marketing materials will you find reference to the typhoid outbreaks that plague Fijians because of the island's faulty water supplies. The corporate entities that Fiji Water has, despite the owner's talk of financial transparency, set up in tax havens like the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg, or the fact that its signature bottle is made from Chinese plastic in a diesel-fueled plant and hauled thousands of miles to its eco-conscious consumers. And, of course, you won't find mention of the military junta for which Fiji Water is a major source of global recognition and legitimacy. Gilmour has described the square bottle as little ambassadors for the poverty-stricken nation. We are Fiji, declare Fiji Water posters across the island, and the slogan is almost eerily accurate. The reality of Fiji the country has been eclipsed by the glistening brand of Fiji the water. On the map, Fiji looks as if someone dropped a fistful of confetti on the ocean. The country is made up of more than 300 islands, 100 inhabited, that have provided the setting for everything from the Blue Lagoon to Survivor to Castaway. Suva is a bustling multicultural hub with a mix of shopping centers, colonial buildings, and curry houses. Some 40% of the population is of Indian ancestry, descendants of indentured sugarcane workers brought in by the British in the mid-19th century. Okay. Yes, that makes some sense now. The Fijian golfer Vijay Singh, mystery solved. The Indian, mystery to me anyway, probably not to several billion people who know exactly what's going on. The Indian-descended native communities have been wrangling for power ever since. The primary industries are tourism and sugar. Fiji Water says its operations make up about 20% of exports and 3% of GDP, which stands at $3,900 per capita. Getting to the Fiji Water factory requires a bone-jarring 4-hour trek into the volcanic foothills of the Yakara Valley. My bus's speakers blasted an ear-splitting soundtrack of Fijian reggae, Bob Marley, Tupac, and Big Daddy Kane as we swerved up unpaved mountain roads linked by rickety wooden bridges. Cow pastures ringed by palm trees gave way to villages of corrugated metal shacks and wooden homes painted in technicolor hues. Chickens scurried past stands selling cell phone minutes. Sugarcane stalks burning in the fields sent a sweet smoke curling into the air. Our last rest stop, half an hour from the bottling plant, was Raki, if I have that right. R-A-K-I. A small town with a square of dusty shops and a marketplace advertising coffin box for sale, cheapest in town. How grim. My Lonely Planet guide warned that Raki water had been deemed unfit for human consumption, and groceries were stocked with Fiji water going for 90 cents a pint, almost as much as it costs in the U.S. Raki has experienced the full range of Fiji's water problems: crumbling pipes, a lack of adequate wells, dysfunctional or flooded water treatment plants, and droughts that are expected to get worse with climate change. Half the country has at times relied on emergency water supplies, with rations as low as 4 gallons a week per family. Dirty water has led to outbreaks of typhoid and parasitic infections. Patients have reportedly had to cart their own water to hospitals, and school children complain about their pipes spewing shells, leaves, and frogs. Some Fijians have taken to smashing open fire hydrants and bribing water truck drivers for a regular supply. The bus dropped me off at a deserted intersection where a weather-beaten sign warning off would-be trespassers in English, Fijian, and Hindi rattled in the tropical wind. Once I reached the plant, the bucolic quiet gave way to the hum of machinery spitting out some 50,000 square bottles made on the spot with plastic imported from China per hour. The production process spreads across 2 factory floors, blowing, filling, capping, labeling, and shrink wrapping 24 hours a day, 5 days a week. The company won't disclose its total sales. Fiji Water's vice president of corporate communications told me the estimate of 180 million bottles sold in 2006, given in a legal declaration by his boss, was wrong, but declined to provide a more solid number. From here, the bottles are shipped to the 4 corners of the globe. The company, which, unlike most of its competitors, offers detailed carbon footprint estimates on its website, insists that they travel on ships that would be making the trip anyway, and that the Fiji payload only causes them to use 2% more fuel. In 2007, Fiji Water announced that it planned to go carbon negative by offsetting 120% of emissions via conservation and energy projects starting in 2008. It has also promised to reduce its pre-offset carbon footprint by 25% next year and to use 50% renewable energy, in part by installing a windmill at the plant. The offsetting effort has been the centerpiece of Fiji Water's $5 million Fiji Green marketing blitz, which brazenly urges consumers to drink imported water to fight climate change. The Fiji Green website claims that because of the 120% carbon offset, buying a big bottle of Fiji water creates the same carbon reduction as walking 5 blocks instead of driving. Former Senior VP of Sustainable Growth Thomas Mooney noted in a 2007 Huffington Post blog post that, quote, "We'd be happy if anyone chose to drink nothing but Fiji water as a means to keep the sea levels down." Metaphorically speaking, anyway. As the online trade journal Climate Biz has reported, Fiji is using a forward crediting model under which it takes credit now for carbon reductions that will actually happen over a few decades. Fiji Water has also vowed to use at least 20% less packaging by 2010, which shouldn't be too difficult given its bottles above average heft. See Territorial Waters, a linked story here to another Mother Jones article. The company says the square shape makes Fiji Water more efficient in transport, and hey, it looks great. Back in 2000, a top official told a trade magazine that what Fiji Water's done is go out there with a package that clearly looks like it's worth more money, and we've gotten people to pay more for us. Well, if you can hack it, I guess you do it. Selling long-distance water to green consumers may be a contradiction in terms, but that hasn't stopped Fiji from positioning its product not just as an indulgence, but as an outright necessity for an elite that can appreciate its purity. As former Fiji Water CEO Doug Carlson once put it, if you like Velveeta cheese, processed water is okay for you. All waters are not created equal is another long-standing Fiji Water slogan. The company has gone aggressively after its main competitor, tap water, by calling it not a real or viable alternative that can contain 4,000 contaminants, unlike Fiji's living water. You can no longer trust public or private water supplies, co-owner Linda Resnick wrote in her book, Rubies in the Orchard. A few years back, Fiji Water canned its waterfall logo and replaced it with a picture of palm fronds and hibiscus. Surface water, Resnick wrote in Rubies. Why would you want to suggest that Fiji came from surface water? The waterfall absolutely had to go. One company newsletter featured the findings of a salt crystal purveyor who claimed that Fiji water rivals the known and significant abilities of holy healing waters in Lourdes, France, and Fatima, Portugal. Switching effortlessly from Catholic mysticism to sci-fi, he added that the water's electromagnetic field frequency enables Fiji water to stimulate our human self-regulation system. That's good to know. In keeping with this rarefied vibe, Fiji Water's marketing has focused on product placement more than standard advertising, from appearances on The Sopranos, 24, The View, and Desperate Housewives, to sponsorship of events like the Emmy Awards, the Avon Walk for Breast Cancer, and Justin Timberlake's Summer Love Tour. It's now hard to find an event where our target market is present and Fiji isn't, according to Resnick. As far back as 2001, Movie Line anointed it one of the top 10 things young Hollywood can't get through a day without. At the Academy Awards, E! has handed out Fiji bottles to the stars. As it happens, the complex where the Oscars is held was owned until 2004 by Fiji Water founder David Gilmour's real estate empire, Trizec, which before its acquisition by Brookfield Properties in 2006 was one of the largest real estate companies in North America, with projects including everything from the Sears Tower to Enron HQ. In a 2003 interview, Gilmour told the London Times that the world's water is being trashed day by day. He would know. Before launching Fiji Water, he co-founded Barrick Gold. He probably confounded them as well when he asked for his paycheck, but he co-founded Barrick Gold, now the largest gold mining enterprise in the world, with operations in hotspots from Tanzania to Pakistan. Its mines, often in parched places like Nevada or Western Australia, use billions of gallons of water to produce gold via a toxic cyanide leaching process. Barrick's practices are so damaging that after an environmental review of the company, the Norwegian government announced last year that it would divest itself of some $200 million in Barrick stock. Gilmour was a powerful presence in Fiji long before he got into the water business. Back in 1969, he launched what would become, with help from a couple of Saudi princes, the region's biggest hotel chain, the Southern Pacific Hotel Corporation, which built a massive resort complex in Fiji. His investors and advisors have included everyone from notorious arms trader Adnan Khashoggi to George H.W. Bush. In 2004, Colin Powell presented him with the Secretary of State's Award for Corporate Excellence for his work in Fiji. Gilmour's Fijian holdings include the exclusive Wakaya Resort, which boasts 6 staffers to each guest and has hosted Bill Gates, Nicole Kidman, and Keith Richards, who famously fell off a tree there, probably the least unhealthy thing he did. He also owns Zenio, an electronic publishing company that produces the digital version of Mother Jones magazine. So he's got us coming and going here. He declined to be interviewed for this story. He decided he wouldn't be interviewed. I could have just gone with that. In the early 1990s, Gilmore got wind of a study done by the Fijian government and aid organizations that indicated an enormous aquifer, estimated at more than 17 miles long, near the main island's north coast. How do you get wind of such a thing? I don't know. Anyway, he obtained a 99-year lease on land atop the aquifer, brought a former Fijian environment minister on board, and launched an international marketing blitz inviting consumers to sample water preserved since before the Industrial Revolution, as he put it. To this day, Fiji Water has nearly exclusive access to the aquifer. The notoriously corrupt and chronically broke government has not been able to come up with the money or infrastructure to tap the water for its people. By the time Gilmore put Fiji Water up for sale in 2004, it was the 4th most popular imported bottled water in the United States. He found eager buyers in the Resnicks, who made their fortune with the flower delivery service Teleflora and the collectibles company Franklin Mint. The Beverly Hills-based couple are also agribusiness billionaires whose holdings include enough almond, pistachio, and pomegranate acreage to make them the biggest growers of these crops in the entire Western Hemisphere. A 2004 report by the Environmental Working Group calculated that in 2002 alone, their agricultural water subsidies totaled more than $1.5 million. They own a pesticide company, Suterra, and Linda Resnick almost single-handedly created the pomegranate fad via their Palm Wonderful brand. Fiji Water wasn't the Resnick's first foray into the water industry. Years ago, they gained control of one of the largest underground water reservoirs in the nation, the Kern Water Bank on the edge of California's Central Valley. This vast holding system, built with public funds in 1999 to help buffer the effects of droughts, stores water from California's aqueducts and the Kern River. It's estimated to be worth more than $180 million on the open market and has allowed the Resnicks to double their acreage of fruits and nuts since 1994, according to the Los Angeles Times. With the profits from their enterprises, the Resnicks have been major players on the political scene, giving more than $300,000 each over the past decade. They have supported mostly marquee Democrats, Obama, John Edwards, Hillary Clinton, Al Franken, though both also donated to the McCain campaign. They give millions to museums, environmental organizations, and other charities. Linda is a trustee of the Aspen Institute, and Stewart is on the board of Conservation International. One of Britney Spears' recent meltdowns led her to stay at the Stewart and Linda Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital at UCLA. In June, the California Institute of Technology announced the creation of the Resnick Sustainability Institute after receiving a $20 million donation from the couple. Fiji Water also gives to a range of conservation groups, including the Waterkeeper Alliance, Oceana, the Nature Conservancy, and Heal the Bay. The charitable works Fiji Water brags about most often, however, are its efforts in Fiji itself, from preserving rainforests to helping fund water and sanitation projects to underwriting kindergartens. This January, remember way back when, after catastrophic floods swept the main island of Viti Levu, the company also donated $500,000 to the military regime for flood relief and gave another $450,000 to various projects last summer. True, some of Fiji Water's good works are more hope than reality, though Linda Resnick insists that we only use biofuels. The Fiji plant runs on diesel generators, and a project to protect 50,000 acres of rainforest, plugged on the actual bottle label, has yet to obtain a lease. Still, Resnick told WNYC last year, "We do so much for these sort of forgotten people. They live in paradise, but they have a very, very hard life." Okay. They do. Just Whatever, lady. Fiji Water may be well advised to spread a bit of its wealth around locally. During the 2000 coup, a small posse of villagers wielding spear guns and dynamite seized on the chaos to take over the bottling plant and threatened to burn it down. The land is sacred and central to our continued existence and identity, a village spokesman told the Fiji Times, adding that no Fijian should live off the breadcrumbs of past colonial injustices. 2 years later, the company created Vatukaloko Trust Fund. Vatukaloko Trust Fund, a charity targeting several villages surrounding its plant. It won't say how much it has given to the trust, but court proceedings indicate that it has agreed to donate 0.15% of its Fijian operations net revenues. A company official testified that the total was about $100,000 in 2007. For perspective, the trade journal Brand Week put Fiji Water's marketing budget at $10 million in 2008. It recently dropped $250,000 to become a founding partner of the new Salt Lake City soccer stadium. Perhaps mindful of the unpleasantness of 2000, today Fiji Water executives refer constantly to the company's role in Fiji's economic life. Our export revenue is paying for the expansion of water access at a pace that Fiji's government has never achieved, the company told the BBC in 2008. If we did cease to exist, Sustainability VP Mooney told U.S. News & World Report the same year, a big chunk of the economy would be gone. The schools that we built would go away, and the water access projects would go away. What Mooney didn't say is that though Fiji Water may fill a void in the impoverished nation, it also reaps a priceless benefit. Tax-free status granted when the company was founded in 1995. The rationale at the time, according to the company, bottled water was a risky business with uncertain chances of success. In 2003, David Gilmour said that his ambition for Fiji Water was to become the biggest taxpayer in the country. Yet the tax break, originally scheduled to expire in 2008, remains in effect, and neither the company nor the government will say whether or when it might end. And when Fiji has tried to wring a bit of extra revenue from the company, the response has been less than cooperative. Of course, again, I remind you that this is an article from some years ago. I don't know if this is still currently the case, but I wouldn't bet against it. Last year, when the government attempted to impose a new tax on water bottles, smart idea, Fiji Water called it draconian, a term it's never used for the regime's human rights violations, and temporarily shut down its plant in protest. While Linda Resnick has called for very public conduct by private companies, she seems to appreciate that, as she wrote in her book, transparency is a lot easier to talk about than it is to realize. The closely held company won't disclose basic data about its business, such as total charity expenditures, and it's gone to some length to shelter assets in secretive tax havens. The Fijian operation, according to court documents filed last year, is owned by an entity in Luxembourg, while its American trademarks are registered to an address in the Cayman Islands. At the moment, Fiji's government certainly seems in no mood to confront Fiji Water, quite the contrary. Learning from the lessons of products, we must brand ourselves, Fiji's ambassador in Washington told a news site for diplomats in 2006, adding that he was working with the Resnicks to try to increase Fiji Water's U.S. sales. A Fiji Water bottle sits at the top of the embassy's homepage, and the government has even created a Fiji Water postage stamp series. The $3 stamp features children clutching the trademark bottles. Fiji Water, for its part, has trademarked the word Fiji in capital letters in numerous countries. Some rejected the application, but not the United States. It has also gone after rival Fijian bottlers daring to use the country's name for marketing. It would have cost too much money for us to fight in court, says Mohammed Altaf, the owner of Aqua Pacific Water, which ended up taking the word Fiji out of its name. It's just like branding a water America Water and denying anyone else the right to use the name America. When such practices are criticized, Fiji Water's response is simple. They don't have a ton of options for economic development, Mooney told U.S. News & World Report, but bottled water is one of them. When someone buys a bottle of Fiji, they're buying prosperity for the country. Without Fiji Water, he said, Fiji is kind of screwed. That's the end of the original article, but there is an update here at the end. It says, news broke in Fiji today. That would be November 18th, 2010. Remember, this is from some time ago, this article. So news broke in November of 2010 that Fiji Water's top official on the island, Director of External Affairs David Roth, was the reason for the abrupt resignation of the country's acting Prime Minister, Ratu Epeli Ganilau. It's a wide variety of names out there for the Fijians. Ganilau shocked the island nation, which has been under martial law since 2009, by emailing his resignation to Prime Minister Voreke Frank Bainimarama. Let me see if I got that one. Bainimarama. I think that's about right. Who is traveling, or was anyway, traveling at the time in China. Fiji Water is a huge economic force on the island, and the company has been criticized for tolerating, there's the name again, Bainimarama, Mara makes it sound like he's Hawaiian. Bainimarama's military regime. I hope I've got that even close to right. See, there's an in-depth report below that is linked. And then this quote, we had some differences over the David Roth issue, Ganilau told the news site Fiji Live without elaborating. Reports from Fiji indicate that a deportation order has been issued for Roth, and Ganilau resigned in protest. Fiji Water has not yet responded to our request for comment. The fight comes at a potentially awkward moment for Fiji Water, which has just been nominated by the U.S. State Department for its 2010 Corporate Excellence Award. The U.S. ambassador in Fiji has also been making surprise visits to Fiji Water's charity events, touting Roth's work. U.S. relations with Fiji have been cool, but Secretary of State Hillary Clinton announced during her Asia tour that the U.S. will be re-engaging with Bainimarama's regime by locating a $21 million USAID climate change office in Fiji, a step some consider an attempt to counter China's rising influence there. We are going to be working together with Australia to persuade the military government in Suva to meet its commitments to bring democracy back to Fiji, Clinton said. Well, that might be something we want to check up on in terms of how well that went. Very interesting, a little guilt-inducing, and an interesting follow-up from the Flint water crisis to the Fiji water crisis. Just a little bit of stream of consciousness there. No pun intended on the stream part.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.